Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Tuesday night lecture sponsored by the Natalie and James Thompson Art Gallery. Today we are very excited to welcome Jonathon Keats. Acclaimed as a poet of ideas by The New Yorker and a multimedia philosopher prophet by The Atlantic, Jonathon Keats is an artist, writer, and experimental philosopher based in the United States and Europe. His conceptually driven transdisciplinary projects explore all aspects of society, adapting methods from the sciences and the humanities. He has exhibited and lectured at dozens of institutions worldwide, from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art to Stanford University to the Triennale di Milano, and from South by Southwest to CERN to UNESCO. He is the author of 6 books on subjects ranging from science and technology to art and design. Most recently, You Belong to the Universe, Buckminster Fuller and the Future, published by Oxford University Press, and is the author of a weekly online art and design column for Forbes. And tonight, Jonathon Keats will talk about some work that he's been doing with the digital media arts faculty and students here at San José State University. In this lecture, he will describe political thought experiments and their artistic implementation. The talk will be followed by a discussion about SJSU's new Future Democracies Laboratory with faculty member Steve Durie. So welcome, Jonathon. We're so excited to have you here.
I am here to talk to you about democracy and about the fact that by many measures, democracy isn't working as well as we might want. It's been a couple thousand years if you want to take Athens as where it all got started, and that, of course, is debatable. But it seems that in the past decades, the past few years, minor incidents like storming of the Capitol and what's happening in Russia might suggest that democracy isn't working so well. Now, I'm not a politician, I'm not a political scientist, and don't really have any business getting into this, except for the fact that I studied philosophy. And philosophers, maybe it's an Athenian thing, we meddle in everything. And so I have been, over the past decade or more, trying to grapple with all of this. And I guess that really what motivates me is taking up this problem and trying to figure out how we might solve it. Now, as I said, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a politician, so the way in which I go about addressing questions, trying to solve problems, maybe is not entirely conventional. I tend to use the thought experiment often as a foundation for my work. A thought experiment basically is where you posit a counterfactual, you imagine an alternative reality, and that becomes a way in which to be able to look at our reality from a different perspective, where perhaps some of the assumptions that we might otherwise be liable to make, that we recognize those assumptions for the assumptions that they are, and we're able to ask some questions that we might otherwise not think of. And basically it starts out by asking, what if? And to give you an example project that I worked on far from here, though I think thematically it has some resonance, was trying to think through xenophobia, trying to think through how we address the fundamental problem of the way in which we tend to alienate one another. And so thinking about that in my convoluted way, I started to think about what would happen if we were all to become aliens, or at least alien hybrid. And we were to use this as a way in which to bring out what we have in common so that we would come together. And so this is a project that I undertook here in Italy in a small town called Fontecchio, appropriately enough. This is a medieval fountain where I modified it ever so slightly. I added meteoritic material into the water such that anybody who would drink this water would become alien hybrid by taking in the mineral content from that meteorite, asteroid originating somewhere between Mars and Jupiter, and that would become part of this person's substance. And then put up a sign, a plaque, so that this would be intentional, so that we could all go into this together deliberately, all become alien together. So if you're interested, you're welcome to drink anytime. The fountain is still flowing. It's been flowing since medieval times, and this will probably outlast me as an undertaking. Whether or not it has solved the problem of xenophobia, I don't think it has, but nevertheless, I think that it has potentially, through this and through the ways in which it's been talked about and written about, potentially it's brought people to think about how we identify self and other from, well, an out of this world point of view that might potentially then lead us to new relationships here on Earth. So coming back down to Earth, just to talk a little bit about how I went about asking what if and where that led me and where it's leading us all with the Future Democracies Laboratory. So since everyone was saying that democracy isn't working, and many people were saying the politicians they're a problem. There's everything from the political gridlock that we see to corruption, bigotry. There are so many ways in which they're not exactly fulfilling their promise. So I decided that I would ask, what if we were to engineer politicians out of the system? We were to engineer a system without politicians. How might that work? And maybe we can give it a try. And so it wasn't exactly a napkin, but I got out a piece of paper and I started to sketch out how to do it. And then I started to think it through in a little bit more detail and develop this circuit, basically attempting to formalize the American democratic system in a way that would have one minor difference from the way in which it works right now. Instead of politicians, we would have random number generators. Now, this was not glib. This was, in fact, really trying to think through what a politician is or what a politician does when a politician is doing his or her job. And at some level, a politician is a black box. And that is a good thing because a politician is not going to vote all the time as you would vote were you a legislator. This is a check against the tyranny of the masses, and it has stood us in good stead, even if not good enough. It seems, however, a principle that we want to try to uphold. So random number generators can be used potentially as alternative to politicians where you set the threshold to give a probability of a vote that will align with a vote that you would give that makes it so that your representatives will not always vote as you would, but on the whole, there's a greater chance than not that they will do so. And so this is what we set out to build, to create a system that would give in the simplest of possible propositions. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, as they used to say? Or in other words, looking at the question of whether the system is working for the people. Or in other words, do we want change or do we want the status quo? Do we want stasis? And that can be, at a very simple level, a way in which to operate, where when people go to the polls, they're asked, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And on that basis, might then be able to set the parameters for their representative. So, as I said, we set out to do this. And that's the thing about a thought experiment, is that it, at least in my world, in my life, I tend to take everything a little too seriously, or I'm maybe a little too naive. And I take thought experiments seriously, thinking that they actually need to be instantiated experimentally to be able to figure out what it all means and to be able to bring people together in that process of figuring it out. Because frankly, I don't know anything. I have questions, I have curiosity, but I'm interested in how we can have a conversation. And that's all the more important, I think, when it is on a subject as essential as democracy. I think that we need democratically to go about the process of figuring out what democracy is, how it has worked, where it has failed us, and how it might work going forward. So I came to San José State University and started to work with Steve Durie, with Rhonda Holberton, and with Joel Slayton, who's now emeritus, who was the one who connected me here initially, on the idea of creating a laboratory, the Future Democracies Laboratory. And that is the laboratory that we have been working on thus far, building a simulator that allows for the simulation of any law whatsoever, potentially, but more generally, that circuit I showed you before is now in software in a way that I came to realize could be a really interesting experimental platform. And that was, in a way, really the motivation for a Future Democracies Laboratory, was to say that what starts out as a provocation also potentially becomes a protocol, becomes a methodology, becomes a means by which to experiment. And so we built a system that allows for the simulation of democracy as we know it, using that circuit, or for manipulation of democracy in any way that you might choose. Well, not any way, we're getting there, but if you wanted 3 presidents or 300, if you wanted to have 5 houses rather than just 2, add a little more dysfunction to the system. Noise is supposed to help out. Why not? Let's see what happens. So we can rapidly prototype democracy, and we can figure out on that basis how a different system might operate. It's a way in which to automate this process of asking what if, and to motivate people to do so through all these options that are put in front of people so that people can start to experiment. And this is something that is online, but also that can be in a public space, in a library, for instance, and it's meant to be. It's meant to be some sort of a locus, a commons for discovering how democracy works. And it leads to all sorts of other questions, including questions about how people vote, how the system expresses the will of the majority in terms of what sort of inputs there might be. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, one way to ask that is to have somebody go to the poll and punch yes or no. Another way might be measure stress level. And you could observe that as a basis for being able to determine potentially, and I don't claim this is a good idea, I don't claim that any of these are good ideas, this could be catastrophically bad, but the point here is to ask what if. So that is a what if that I'm going to invite Steve up to the stage to talk to you about, because he has been doing a lot of work in that realm for the project.
So the part that I was going to share today is the work I've been doing with Jonathn and with everyone else in the group, including students for the last, year and a half to 2 years, where we started with this project and all the things that, of course, you can imagine that have gone through iterations because of the COVID and everything. The thing that I wanted to sort of share first is just when I started this project, one thing that I thought was really interesting was this idea of using sensors of any kind to evaluate things like decision making. I actually did a project a long time ago as a grad student on, at that time, the concern with the obscenity laws. And we did a bunch of projects that were related to sort of federal funding of obscenity or of art projects that were deemed obscene. And I worked on a project where I wanted to sort of bring up this idea that you would vote on a daily basis of what was obscene, so that, of course, the sort of status quo or what culture would sort of deem obscene would sort of be kept in line with what our values are, so that, you know, we sort of follow the curve, because it seemed at the time whatever artists were making was sort of out of step with at least some people in other parts of America. So it was interesting to me to think about this idea of evaluating oneself and making decisions based on not just sort of the normal sort of conscious decision-making process we do when we go vote, but also sort of listening to our unconscious behavior and the sort of whole investigation into that. So the project that I started with was just to start using some very simple biosensors. These are all kind of part of the suite of sensors that are both obviously used in the medical field, but they're also part of the repertoire of sensors that are used, but probably most famously in lie detectors or polygraph machines. And so this is just a simple oximeter. And so we wanted to see if we could take this as a baseline for like measuring stress or measuring sort of parasympathetic responses in our bodies when we sort of look at material, to sort of gauge whether the material we're looking at is somehow telling us something about what we feel about it. You know, again, this idea of maybe the status quo versus change. And so we started mocking up a simulator. And again, we had sort of started off with sort of making a hardware interface, but then figured that we were going to have to make this online and virtual. And so we started playing with phone interfaces. And it's actually a pretty amazing thing that I feel always obligated to share. There's lots of apps out on the net or on that you can get. This one is called, what is this one called? Cardio. That you can actually use it to read your blood pressure levels, if you didn't know, on heart rate and oxygen levels, I should say. And so we use this sensor to sort of create a sort of interface where you could use this and then go through a series of sort of material and find out sort of what your baseline sort of heart rate is, and then when you start seeing other material, does it indeed change? And then can we use that as a way of sort of saying something about the material as it relates to sort of political direction or political ideology or something like that. So when you would use it, you use it for about 15 seconds. You can take a baseline heart rate, and then this would show you the results. You can, of course, save this within the phone, but in terms of this prototype here, you could enter it in manually at the bottom, and it would log sort of your kind of like baseline one. And then we would move to another screen where you're looking at some material that we sort of think of as like conventionally relaxing material, like Yellowstone and other things. There was a selection of about 5 or 6 different video clips that you can choose from. And then, of course, you would, once you did this for a while, you would read the sensor and log in the sort of other one. And then the third one would be sort of news-related, the ones that are sort of the topical thing of the day. And this, of course, is a news clip from the day of January 6th, which is also just reminds me that we had this weird sort of strange phenomena that every time we'd have a democracy meeting online in Zoom, that there would be some sort of political thing going down. So I remember we had a democracy meeting later the afternoon on January 6th, which I thought was an interesting thing of like the news taking over art, and it was hard to sort of like process all that stuff while we were working on this project. But anyway, so this one would be obviously something where it's news related, it might be related to politics, and then you would use this as well to measure your heart rate change. Perhaps it went up, perhaps it went down. And then this would sort of show you this sort of baseline, the reading, and then the readings from video A and video B, and this difference at the bottom would sort of tell you whether you obviously had some sort of relative change in what you were doing. So this is a project that's sort of ongoing. The thing we're doing now, because we can probably continue with this project in a physical capacity, is creating an oximeter that's going to be physical and in the space on a kiosk machine, so that you can walk into the space and sort of recreate, sort of in a quasi way, the dynamics of walking up to like a voting machine, but instead of sort of making conscious decisions like picking A, B, or C, that you would use this machine to vote. The other part here that I just wanted to share was the things we've been doing in the last year and a half related to looking into sort of different kinds of sensors and different kinds of ways of investigating this stuff, including also the students that have been involved. This is an early project we did where we started having some workshops to sort of familiarize yourself with familiarize ourselves with the different ways that this project is sort of addressing sort of the strange phenomena of things like randomness or things like unconscious behavior. So this is actually a workshop where we did a couple of things, but one of them was to play with this idea of learning more about what randomness truly is. And so Jonathn mentioned earlier that the simulator project was incorporating randomness into the sort of decision-making of our simulated political figures, our simulated congressmen or simulated presidents. This was actually just a simple exercise to learn about what does randomness really, really look like, because we sort of think about it sort of in the vernacular, but do we really experience it in a true way? And one of the best ways to do it is to sort of play with this exercise where you have people make up random numbers. So Seti at the top there would actually just go about filling those in, sort of simulating in their head what heads and tails looks like. And that the B set would be another group of people that would actually bother to flip the coins, and what I think they did 100 coin tosses, and actually log what happens. And it's always this sort of interesting experiment, because the tendency, our gut intuition is we're going to see something that is going to be more random than what we make because we're making it ourselves. But it turns out is when people actually look at it, the random one has ironically patterns in it that are counterintuitive to our sense of what randomness is. So the people at the top, they're always making sure there's nothing that's ever sort of consistent, like no two heads are the same, or especially a run of like heads or tails. Where the randomness, it does do that, because it is in the end just as likely that you're going to see patterns as not patterns. And so this was just one of these exercises where we get to play with the familiarity of this kind of stuff, playing with what is it like to use some kind of mathematical procedure to make decisions where you're not obviously making conscious choices. This is another project that we did sort of at the start. I had another class make some biosensors. This is one of them. This is a GSR sensor, and it was based on the idea that it was basically a color picker project. So you had a bunch of colors you could look at, and you could use the GSR and your sort of relative stress levels to figure out whether you like sort of pistachio, or you like dark chocolate, or you like raspberry, yellow, blue, etc. And it was a way for you to sort of play with that idea. Again, I think, talking about the sort of provocation aspect of this and trying to figure out what are these things good for, and can they be used in a familiar way where we sort of feel really comfortable and sort of identify what they can and can't do. So I think, Jonathn, this is where I hand it off to you again. I'll put this back on E.
Come up as we have taken seriously what it might look like for people to make decisions at the polls, where they're not necessarily doing so by marking off a box or punching a card, and even asking the question, do we really need to use everybody's garage every year or two? Maybe we could actually have the polls open all the time, everywhere. And we could have biometric devices that would potentially use the technologies that have been explored in Steve's class, such as heart rate and heart rate variability, but potentially even more sophisticated than that. The stress hormones, such as cortisol, that are very well correlated with stress level and are increasingly measurable with portable devices. So one what if is, what if we all had that all the time? And our politicians, remember, you don't need to fly people to Washington, D.C., a lot of carbon footprint savings there, but also they can switch anytime, all the time. You could potentially have that weighting where it isn't necessarily 70-30 or 30-70, but you could have a sliding scale. There are many different ways. Or you could have the frequency with which legislation is put through the system increase or decrease, where you might imagine, because one thing that you realize when you start talking about democracy in this way is that it starts to seem an awful lot like a system that the people who formulated the American democratic system didn't know about, but that has been here for a lot longer than we have. Evolution, in other words. That there's a way in which this is evolutionary, and that randomness actually in some way has a quality where you have a system and you have a fitness factor, but the randomness is the means by which you reach a higher level of fitness. You have the degrees of freedom, so to speak. You have that play of possibilities that allows for an evolutionary process. So this evolutionary process potentially is one where not only are you doing it on the basis of the thresholds for your politicians, but you're also potentially doing so for the frequency with which laws are being passed through the system, and maybe you even take the current body of law and you just start mutating it. Again, taking inspiration from evolution here, you mutate it in a way where the rate of mutation potentially is another factor that could be variable. So suddenly, when you start to look at these ways in which to measure people's internal state, you have a lot of other ways in which that can manifest in terms of how the system works. Of course, we need to be asking whether this actually does represent our internal state, as well as other minor issues such as privacy. We need to be asking all of that. But in the process of asking what if, in addition to asking all of those questions, I started asking questions about who. If you're looking at cortisol level, for instance, you're measuring that in terms of the cortisol level going up or down over time as a way in which to be able to determine whether the system is working for a constituent. Basically, are you getting more stressed or less as policies go into effect? Do you need to change to other policies, or is it just right? Once you start to think about that as a possibility for grown-ups, why not for children? I never really understood why children weren't allowed to go to the polls other than that they didn't have enough footstools, but nevertheless, there generally are not children at the polls. Children are, in fact, forbidden from voting. Well, what if you were even to extend it beyond that? When we look at the phylogenetic tree, we find that we are pretty minor, and are not by any measure whatsoever. There aren't many of us compared to all the other life on our planet. And not only that, but I think if you were to look at this from the perspective of most of the life, including fellow humans, you would find that we're not doing a very good job at governance.
Not only is democracy seemingly failing at the level of how the system is in a state of gridlock, the politicians are often not operating in the best interest of their constituency, but also that there is, when you look at our policies and you look at the catastrophic state of our environment and how our policies continually seem to bring us toward worse rather than better conditions, it seems that maybe we're not so good at making decisions after all, or perhaps we just need other perspectives. We need to bring others into this process as a matter of the wisdom that is to be found, and also as a matter potentially of fairness, of the fact that our decisions affect everyone, all of these species. And when you look at it, we are contributing very little. We use this term, seems rather glib to me, but I'll use it anyway, ecosystem services. All the ways in which other life forms are effectively making our lives possible, and all the ways in which we're making life harder for all of them. And when you look at the phylogenetic tree and you start doing a count, and when you especially start to look at this from the standpoint of biomass, you look at measurements showing that we're less than 1%. And plants are the majority, 80%, according to some measures. So what if we were to give plants the vote? What if we were to enfranchise other species into democratic decision-making processes, and we were to start with the vast majority? The plants already play a role in our legal system, not a role that I would really envy. This bearing tree here has the obligation of standing for as long as possible to be able to show if one of the cornerstones for a property has been moved, because it's harder to move a tree. That's the logic. So you can use the tree as a way in which to figure out whether, in fact, the property measurement is true. And that is a way in which we've given trees some level of authority, but it doesn't seem like it really is giving them much of anything. It's kind of just putting a few holes in the bark and giving them some task that better supports what we do, our lives. So thinking about this, we started to experiment, looking at the idea that stress level could be measured also for animals. Cortisol actually is relatively common across many animals. And in the case of plants, there are phytohormones, such as ethylene. And so we started to experiment with ethylene sensors. And by we here, I mean Steve, who is considerably better than I am with a soldering iron and actually knows what he's doing. And this is one of our first prototypes, attempting to measure ethylene level, which we did in the field. We did our research at Stanford University. They didn't know it, but here we are, and that's the evidence.
A real Stanford eucalyptus grove there.
That is right. And we were able, on that basis, to figure out, well, we figured out one thing, which was the device isn't working. So that led us to another realization, which is we need another one. So we've gotten another one, and we are now in the process of calibrating, and we're going to start looking at ways in which we can make these measurements, and potentially to do so at scale, at the scale of an entire forest, or at least at a precinct scale, where it's possible to measure volatiles in the air, because ethylene, like all phytohormones, are volatiles, and plants use these because they are modular in structure. They don't have a central nervous system. In order for one part of the plant to find out there's something stressful happening on another part of the plant, like aphids, it's most efficient to emit to secrete a volatile in the air that is then sensed by another part of the plant, such that the plant can emit toxins to be able to control the aphid problem. So we're basically measuring that, but we're not doing it for the sake of aphids here. We're doing it for the sake of democracy and for the sake of figuring out how the world works and how it might work in a way that would take into account policies and policy making that would be beneficial to all. And we're looking at this very broadly. So there's also a student here, Kira Chu Lim, who has been looking at electrical conductance and at capacitance. And we are going to continue through the Future Democracies Laboratory to look at all these different ways in which to make these measurements. Now, what I've left out of all this is the minor detail of the United States Constitution. None of this is constitutional. None of this is going to have any validity whatsoever in terms of input for who ends up in office. So what are we going to do about it? How do we act on this in the future, and what might we do in the short term to get us there? Well, in the future, I'm working with Earth Law Center, which is an NGO that is involved in ecocentric law, trying to figure out some of these questions and looking at some of the systems that are very much in flux right now, such as Chile, where the Constitution is currently being rewritten and where rights of nature will potentially be central to it. But I'm also looking closer to home at what we might do in the short term. And I realized at some point that there's another way in which voting happens that actually is quite influential. Gallup, YouVote, polling services, the way in which polls are representing, to some degree, the will of the people, and doing so in a way that is public enough that it influences politicians. Whether it's in terms of policies or in terms of endorsements, there's a way in which this has an influence. So what if we were to take that system and we were to apply it to the question at hand? We were to crowdsource the vote by bringing people out into the field to be able to measure stress level and stress level change for the plants in their midst. And to me, this seems to have multiple advantages, or at least multiple benefits, which range from the fact that it's a lot more doable than trying to deploy sensors like we were looking at a moment ago with all the soldering and the fact that they are not so reliable, but also because when we do so in a way that involves many people involved in this polling process, it overcomes what sometimes is referred to as plant blindness. This way in which when we look at plants as if they were objects. And this is true also for so many other species. Unfortunately, it's all too true in terms of how we look at each other as humans. But starting from this perspective, starting from what is very far from us in terms of the phylogenetic tree, which is also intentionally, of course, within the spirit of the thought experiment of asking what if, a provocation that can then get us back to looking at all the ways in which we are not seeing one another. This becomes a way in which to then potentially learn what the plants in our neighborhood have to tell us, and also to learn to live with them more fairly and more fully. So how do you do that? Well, I say banana. Bananas, like every fruit, they ripen as a result of our old friend ethylene. Ethylene is a stress hormone that is involved in the ripening process. And so you can eat a banana, but you could potentially, alternatively, or before you eat that banana, you could use that banana as a sort of a ready-made probe to probe ethylene level without all that soldering, without all the electronics. So what we've started to experiment with is a protocol for a banana differential. So it doesn't work just to say, let's get a bunch of bananas. We need to be scientific about this in terms of how we observe the banana. And the way in which to do this is by taking two bananas, your banana for purposes of polling and your control, and putting them, separating them, and then being able to observe the rate at which ripening is happening, or in other words, take the measure after 4 days and see how much the banana has yellowed or blackened relative to your control. And then do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And that differential is going to be able to show you over time whether the plant is getting more or less stressed. And then if we have enough data, we can potentially correlate this with changes in policy, with who's in office. We can recommend politicians by way of endorsements. We can have an effect right here, right now. And so we're starting to do that, or at least to figure it out. And here you can see some student experiments that are early manifestations of this process. And we're getting there, slowly, figuring it all out. And in the spirit of getting there, figuring it all out, I figure we might as well do it right here, tonight. So this plant here, we have a banana. We have been able to make a measure because there's another banana over here. So on the basis of measuring the difference between these two bananas and then doing it again when the next Tuesday night lecturer comes along, we can start to get some sort of a metric as far as whether this particular plant is more or less stressed by the prospect of entering into the democratic process where we're actually paying attention and ideally the plant is making us the wiser. And I don't know where this will lead us. I have looked at this as a way in which we can start to build at scale, and I'm working with Steve and with San José State University through the Future Democracies Laboratory to figure that out. But we are still fundamentally here a laboratory. This is not ultimately, in spite of the fact that it is intended to start conversation and therefore there is a provocation to it, it is manifestly and inherently an experiment that happens at every level, from the level of going out there with your bananas to the level of asking what if, and doing so collectively, trying to figure this all out. The Future Democracies Laboratory is an ongoing project which is going to soon manifest here on campus in the galleries, where we're going to have a showroom that's going to show some of the research that we've been doing and allow for you to experiment with the simulator, which will then go online, as well as ideally to become a part of it. Because the laboratory is open and we are currently seeking anybody and everybody who has an interest in this, who can expand upon it. As I said, I know nothing. I get by asking what if, but I'm not even very good at that. I can just start that process, and what I'm hoping happens as a result of speaking here tonight, as a result of our exhibition that's coming up in just a few weeks, and as a result of this project over the long term, is that we can better understand what it is that we want, what sort of future we need, and we can let that inform our democracy such that we make a democracy that really represents our beliefs and that really serves the purpose of governing our society in a way that is for the betterment of all of us. So I will leave it at that to open it up to conversation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Steve.
And Steve is not off the hook as far as answering either. This is a project where the Future Democracies Laboratory is based at San José State University,
but where also other dimensions of this are being investigated through other institutions with other expertise. I mentioned Earth Law Center earlier, where that's where a lot of our legislation is developed and where we're exploring both the legal and the political ramifications in very practical terms. There's also a collaboration with the University of Southern California with the Annenberg School, which is the School of Communications, looking at this question of communication and looking at it from the standpoint of how best to communicate what is, in the case of the plants, which is where we're starting that process, not necessarily where we're ending it. In the case of the plants, what is discovered through this process of polling them, how might that be communicated in a way that is effective in the sense of being informative and potentially influential. Ideally not influential in the sense of propaganda, but in the sense of influencing the conversation. And the essential part of that is starting out from the beginning, working with media partners. And I can't yet tell you who they are because we're still developing those relationships, but there are a couple major media partners who we are starting to discuss this with in terms of ways in which this then becomes, through those partnerships, as Gallup has done and as other polling services have done, it becomes a public service, becomes something that is readily available and is highly visible. So that's one way of addressing the question that you bring up, which is to say that the process by which polls are influencing people can be explored and even called into question in terms of asking who is polled and in what way they're polled, and potentially then to start to take it apart in terms of how that polling is expressed and how this relates to the populace and could do so more effectively. But another part of it is what you're speaking to in terms of media polarization and the fact that media now have a tendency, perhaps even more than in the past, and it is not necessarily the case that in the past we were in some idle, but perhaps more than in the past, to go to extremes, to drive people apart, and to do so for the sake of the bottom line, or because there is some political agenda on the part of those who happen to supply the ink. Again, there's nothing so new about this. Rupert Murdoch is not so far from William Randolph Hearst, and potentially is less extreme than Hearst in terms of the way in which this is working out. But we are in the here and now, and we need to address that. So where this can happen, I believe, is where we start to think about the news, the media, more pluralistically. And what I mean is that we don't need to stop at the level of a yes or no vote or change or stasis. There are ways in which to become far more nuanced in terms of giving the bully pulpit to other species. In other words, ways in which to publish their perspective and even potentially to look at how their perspective drives the editorial agenda of the publication as the source and maybe also as consumers of the news. Now, I've done a little bit of work in this realm. I've made pornography for plants. I made pornography for plants in the most effective way that I knew, which was that I filmed honeybees pollinating flowers and projected that onto their foliage, on the theory that there were already many filmmakers out there who were very successful with humans, and I had no chance in that realm. But plants, by virtue of performing photosynthesis, in a sense, they're an ideal audience, maybe better than us, maybe more suited than us, to cinema as a form. But I also am not a plant, so I don't really know where to begin. So as so many filmmakers do, I started in pornography by making these films that were going to be titillating to plants, and then basically by figuring out from a plant's perspective how movies might manifest in terms of how they might be meaningful. So I then tried to go legit. I went into travel documentaries, filming skies in Europe that I projected onto plants in New York, and I've now been doing some sci-fi where I'm taking plants on these interstellar voyages, taking spectral signatures of different star systems. And all that is well and good, but I do think there's also the potential for a news channel for other species. I think that other species, including plants, for them to be more informed is absolutely in their interest and in the interest of all of us, because of the fact that the way in which the world works right now is highly centralized in certain respects that are completely outside the scope of how most species live their lives. For most of evolutionary history, we didn't have Web 3. We didn't even have the internet. I know that for some of the room that may be a surprise, but we didn't. Or television. We didn't have mass media. We didn't have ways in which we were able to communicate at scale. But also, we didn't have ways in which to act at scale. And we are acting at scale in ways that are coordinated, that are potentially increasingly disconnected, and I would argue not only potentially, but we're seeing the consequences of this, where not only are the decisions that we're making not necessarily very wise as a result of the fact that we are trying to run a system using systems underlying that system that we built only recently that we scarcely understand, that we really are not evolved to be able to work with very effectively, but also because of the fact that most of us, that phylogenetic tree, are not well informed and therefore are not able to adapt, to be able to respond to what decisions get made, what actions are taken. So what would CNN for plants look like? Well, I see a lot of potential, and obviously it starts out with potential to show environmental conditions which are likely to be extraordinarily important, and which, by informing the botanical population ahead of time, perhaps gives some time to be able then to respond to it in a way that can be not only captured through democratic decision-making processes to the extent that they are involved in those, but also in terms of behaviors. So to me, the question of how to understand the political perspective of other species is part of a much larger question, which is the question of how to understand other species and how to be understood by them, and how ultimately to create some sort of a system that is, in terms of our technology, in alignment with biology, with ecology. That there is a possibility that what we think, what we say, and what we do is not in isolation, and that ultimately we are able to overcome this illusion that we have that we are apart from nature, to become a part of it through the systems that we have built, and through the systems and the ways of being that have been here for longer than we've been around, and that are so essential to us and to the planet as a whole in order to be able to figure out how to get by, what to do, and how to live.